Okay, it is 7:55, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know it's 5 minutes early, but I'm going to do the course announcements and reminders as usual. And for the most part, there's nothing new there. So, again, I don't mind getting started early. So, here we go. Let me share my screen and then I'll pull up the PowerPoint. There we go. There's the screen. All right. So, here we go. As usual, I'll remind you to check your emails and course announcements before you coming into campus or into class. Today is a great example for that. Due to the 2 hour delay in Putnam County, my children are at home, and therefore I'm also teaching from home. Um, but anyway, yeah, so make sure you check those. Also, it's just good practice anyway to make sure you keep an eye on the emails and course announcements. There's always good information there. As also a reminder, Lab 2 and Pre Lab 3 are past due. You can still do them for partial credit. The semester's still pretty young, so I'm accepting that. Plus, we've been having weather issues. Moving forward, soon I'll go back to what I mentioned on day one with the syllabus that late work will not be accepted, right? So we're almost getting to that point. So make sure you're staying on top of things. Let me know if you need help. I've received an email from one of your classmates who said they wanted to do resubmit something with corrections, but they didn't see what they needed to correct. So again, let me know if you need help. You can meet me online. I can walk you through it. Also, there's two ways of giving feedback on those labs. One is I'll mark up the PDF, so you can see I like put an X on things, or I'll write -1 here or +1 there. And then there's also the written feedback. And I'm assuming the student who asked me the question must not have been looking to see if I marked up the PDF, because I will always do one or the other. Which brings me to this point. Again, since we're moving forward and we're getting used to things and the semester has been going on for a while, moving forward, I'm going to start giving less and less feedback because I know some people just don't care. And I'm really busy, so I don't have time to give everybody feedback when not everybody wants it. So if you want more feedback, let me know. I'll be happy to give you more feedback. I prefer it. But like I said, I don't want to waste my time giving detailed feedback to somebody who just doesn't really care. So let me know. What else? Exam one, like I've been saying, it's scheduled for this Friday. We are running a little bit behind, so we'll see if we're going to have time to do that. We might have to push it back. Um, and of course, if you have an opinion on that, feel free to email me and let me know. Like, hey, I would definitely prefer to push it back, or maybe you prefer not to push it back. Maybe you want the information to be fresh in your head when we take it. So just let me know. But anyway, if we do take it Friday, you can make sure you bring a computer. If you don't have one, let me know. And I'll make arrangements to get you a computer. Make sure you bring a charger for your computer, because obviously you don't want your um, computer to go dead while we're taking this exam. And you're going to need a calculator. So, well, I take that back. You might not need a calculator. The math is going to be very basic. It's just going to be like the ones I told you about, figuring out the atomic mass given the proton numbers and neutron numbers. So really basic math. But again, if you think you're going to need it, bring a calculator, because you cannot use your phone's calculator, because I won't know if you're using a calculator or if you are just looking things up on your phone, which is not allowed. So yeah, so be prepared for that. If you can't make it on Friday, or if you need to make other arrangements to maybe meet me online, or come to my office, we can do it some other time other than Friday. I heard a noise. I assume someone's here, but I just want to make sure that's what the situation is, and um, make sure that I'm still recording, because I don't want to go through what I went through last week where I recorded. Yeah, good. Katie's here. Okay. Anyway, yeah, Katie, I went ahead and started the announcements early because none of it is new. So it's all been repeat of stuff I've said before. So anyway, moving forward, let's see here. From current slide, there we go. Um, yeah, so that's when the exam is. It's going to be on chapters 1, 2, and 3. Speaking of which, hopefully very soon we're going to finish chapter 2. But then when we get to chapter 3, we're going to go through it very quickly, because chapter 3 covers cells. And there's barely going to be any questions about chapter 3 on the exam. And all the important stuff that I want you to learn about cells, you're going to learn later in the semester, right? So, for example, starting for next exam, you're going to be learning things about like how cells make energy or convert energy, excuse me. And then after that, you're going to learn how cells reproduce and stuff like that. So, again, when we hit chapter 3, which will hopefully be on Wednesday, we're going to go through it very quickly. All right. As always, I'll remind you attendance is mandatory, participation is graded. If you're watching the video at a later time, so not right now, if you're live with me right now, this does not pertain to you, but if you're watching the video that's been recorded and put on YouTube, you just do what you usually do, write down the attendance word every time I say one, take a screenshot every time I say one, and then at the end, send me an email that has those screenshots and the attendance words, and then ask one question about the material covered in the lecture. And if you're with me right now on the live stream, you're going to do the same thing, other than the fact you're not going to send me any screenshots. You're just going to write down the attendance words, and you're going to make sure you send it by 9 a.m. But yes, don't forget, too, to ask me one question about the material that was covered today. So are there any questions before we get started? All right, good. Well, the first word for attendance, I guess I'll circle it here. Check. So again, if you're with me right now on the live stream, you do not need to take a screenshot of that. But if you're watching this video at a later date, make sure you take a screenshot, and I should see a picture that shows that I have circled the word check. All let's get moving then. I'm going to try to get through this pretty quickly. If I'm going too quickly, slow me down. Let me know. Anyway, this is what we left off talking about. There was a new word that you learned, and it's isomers. And isomers are where you have molecules that have the same formula. In this case, this example, C6H12O6, which hopefully you recognize from Lab 2, but different arrangements, right? And like I mentioned, this is a good reminder of one of the things we talked about on Friday, which is this relationship between structure and function. And even though it's not always 100% true, it's good enough for us. And the thing I'm saying that it's not 100% true is that very often the structure is related to function. And in a situation like this, for example, we can look at these two molecules, and even without being a chemist, you can see that they're very similar, but slightly different. You can see those slight differences there. And because of that, you could correctly assume that they are very similar also in the way those molecules behave. So, for example, these things happen to be sugars. So they're both sweet, right? And fructose happens to be sweeter than glucose for humans. But anyway, you don't need to know anything about fructose or glucose. That's just an example. And that, again, is what an isomer is. And you need to know what an isomer is for the exam. So to remind you, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, that means there are 3 I words that you need to know. Ions, right? So if you change the number of electrons on an atom, right? If you charge it by giving it electrons or taking away electrons, that would be an ion. Isomer here obviously is when you have the same chemical formula but different structures. And isotope, if you remember, is when you have the same, you have an atom and you change the number of neutrons, right? So if you change the number of neutrons, you have an isotope. So those are the 3 I words that you're going to need to know for the exam. If there's no questions, let's move forward. This is another good example. Again, you don't have to know it. And this is also a drawing that we don't use these drawings in this course. So I don't expect you to know what this means. But again, even without knowing what it means, you could just look at this and be like, wow, that's very similar. As a matter of fact, it's so similar that they're just mirror images of each other, right? So this is another great example of an isomer. And again, I think it's a really good example because one of them, you can see right here, the one on the left, it's used in nasal decongestant and things like that, right? What's that stuff you rub? Vicks Vapor Rub, I believe has that in it. And then, of course, this version of it, just the mirror image, that's what's used to make meth or in meth. That's what's in meth. So it goes to show you how making a slight change to something can make a big difference. But anyway, that's just an example. You do not need to know anything about that. And if you download this PowerPoint, you can click on that link in this little video. I think it's a video or an article, one of the two. They kind of digs deeper into that idea. Oh, yeah. Anyway, yeah. And obviously for making these 2 people are making meth from the show Breaking Bad. All right. So let's take another step back. Yes, we just finished talking about isomers, but remember, let me take a huge step back. Right now in this chapter 2, which is all about chemistry, we are talking about biological molecules. There's four main types of biological molecules. There's carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Right now, we are talking about carbohydrates. Specifically, we are talking about the monomer of carbohydrates. And if you remember, the monomers are those repeating the smallest parts that repeat to make the polymer. So this is the smallest part of a carbohydrate, and they are monosaccharides, right? This is what we were talking about, monosaccharides. This information, I was probably not going to be on the exam, but it is good. It is worth noting that monosaccharides are the main fuels for cellular work, and that was a question I asked on Friday, I believe it was, and I think it was Inca that answered it correctly. But yeah, that is the main purpose for monosaccharides, right? Cellular work. Of course, we eat other stuff, and that is put to use too, right? The energy from that food is also put to use, but monosaccharides are the main fuel, especially glucose. So then in the next chapter, not the next chapter, but once we get past this stuff for exam one, once we move on to exam two, we're going to come back to that idea, this idea of breaking down glucose so cells can do work. But we'll come back to that. It's also worth noting, not that you need to know for this for the exam, but in water, a lot of times monosaccharides form rings. And I guess the only reason this is important is because, if you drew C6H12 properly, it probably looked a little bit something like this, or maybe sideways instead of vertical. But like I said, if you drew it in the lab, it probably looked like that. But in this chapter, you're going to see a lot of times it's depicted as this. And so this is the only reason I'm bringing this up. Well, that in the textbook brought it up, but I just want to mention, yes, these two things look different, but this is sugar, right? This is C6H12O6. I just don't want you to get confused and think, wait a minute, last time he talked about sugar, it looked like this thing on the right. Now he's saying this thing on the right is sugar. But now you know, right? Once you put them in water, they form rings. And the fact that they're rings are important because keep in mind, again, these are monomers. So we're going to link a bunch of monomers up to make polymers, and we'll talk about that later. And when they link up, this is how they do it. These rings are the things that link up. So anyway, the next word for attendance, speaking of which, is ring. So if you're taking a screenshot because you're here at a later date, that's what you're going to, or you're watching this at a later date, and that's what you're going to take a screenshot of. And I should see an arrow pointing to a ring. But again, if you're live with me right now, you don't need to do the screenshots. You just need to write down the attendance words and email those to me before 9 a.m. And include one question about the materials covered. All right, so that's it for monosaccharides. When you put two monosaccharides together, you get a disaccharide. So here we go. Here's some examples. Sucrose, lactose, maltose. You probably heard of some of these before. When people talk about sugar, this is usually what they're talking about. Like table sugar or the sugar you use in baking, that is sucrose. And sucrose is made of glucose and fructose. Now, I'm probably not going to ask you about any of this stuff on the exam. If I do, I'm certainly not going to ask you what part, I'm not going to ask you what is lactose made of, or I'm not going to ask you what is glucose made of, right? Or excuse me, maltose made of. I'm not going to ask you that. If anything, you might need to know that sucrose is, again, what is commonly referred to as sugar. So when people are talking about sugar outside of a biology class, that's usually what they're talking about. So you need to know, that sucrose is table sugar, and maybe that it's made up of glucose and fructose. But again, I'm not sure about that yet. Anyway, any questions so far about what a disaccharide is? All right. If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this animation where these two monomers come together in a dehydration reaction. Remember that to make this disaccharide of sucrose. But again, it's a good time to remind you that when you bring things together in this class, like when you're building a larger molecule, that is a dehydration reaction. But there it is. Even though we didn't see it animated, this is what it looks like. This is the drawing of it, right? So again, we have a glucose and galactose. We bring them together to make lactose. In the process, we've taken water out of the reactants, you could say, right? We've produced water, and that is a dehydration reaction. Just like when you produce water, you are becoming, like when you sweat or urinate or whatever it is, when you're producing water, in a sense, you're becoming a little bit more dehydrated. So dehydration reaction. Any questions about that? All right. Some examples we already told you, but just presenting it in a different way. So we already talked about lactose, and lactose is found in milk. I mentioned maltose, but I didn't mention where it's found. But you can find it in beer, and malted milkshakes, and malted milk candy balls. I forget what are those called, Whoppers, I think. And of course, again, the one that we're very familiar with is sucrose. But I'm not going to ask you this stuff, right? It's not a nutrition class. So, are there any questions about that? All right. So here's some information that's not in the textbook, but it is from the old textbook. So I kept it in the PowerPoint because it is pretty relevant to your everyday life. People talk about this stuff. I'm sure you've heard of something called high fructose corn syrup. Um, well, this is made in a commercial process, right? What they do is they take glucose, and you remember glucose and fructose are isomers, and they convert it to fructose. And again, fructose is sweeter, right? So they can use less of it. They use less fructose, like if it's, instead of if you're going to need, I don't know, 10 grams of glucose to make a batch of something, you could use less than that, like maybe 8 grams. I'm just making these numbers up, but you can use less of it because fructose is sweeter. So it saves them money. Um, and if you want to, for extra credit, in an email and a separate email, don't send it with your attendance email, you can look up the calories, right? So, for example, how many calories are in 10 grams of glucose versus 10 grams of fructose? You could look it up if you want. But anyway, again, for the exam, that's not important. I did share a video recently on the Facebook group where there's a nutritionist lady, a doctor, and I thought it was a pretty good video. She mentions this too, and the real purpose of that video was talking about how AI is not always very smart. And she gave the example of she looked up, is there high fructose corn syrup in baby formula? And AI said, yes, there is. And then she had to correct AI, say, hey, I have a PhD in this, and that's not true. There is fructose, but not high fructose corn syrup. Oh, no, no, what was it? She said there was corn syrup, but not high fructose corn syrup. And then AI was like, oh yeah, you're right. But anyway, I'm all going off on a tangent. I guess the point here is don't trust AI. Verify what AI tells you. And also, a good time to remind you: don't use AI in this course. Right? It's a valuable tool, but you need to learn the stuff, the basics, before you start relying on tools like that. Anyway, here's a picture of what we're talking about. Right? So you've got this um, corn, which has a lot of starch in it. We'll talk about that soon, actually. Um, we break that starch down to its smaller parts, which is glucose, and then they do a little chemical magic and convert that glucose to the fructose. Um, and yeah, that's how they make it. Again, I'm not going to ask you to know that for the exam or this, but again, it is worth mentioning because it is relevant to your everyday life. Back when that old textbook was published, I think it was like 2016 at the latest, right? So that was pretty old. It's a decade at least. But anyway, back then when they published it, they said that the average American consumes about 130 pounds of sugar per year. So if you want to look it up again on a separate email for extra credit, you could look that up and answer that question. What is it now? How much does the average American consume now? Or what about the average person on Earth? Um, as always, if you do that for extra credit, don't forget to include your source. Anyway, so obviously it's bad. Sugar is a major cause of tooth decay and overconsumption. It increases the risk of type 2 diabetes and heart disease, and they're basically empty calories, right? So we need calories, and that does provide us with calories, but it doesn't provide us with much of anything else. But again, not a this is not a nutrition class. So, excuse me. Uh, thought I had to sneeze. Nope, I did. Anyway, um, yeah, I'm not going to ask you any of these questions on the exam. But this does bring us to our next attendance word, which is smile. Smile is the next word for attendance. And if there's no questions, we will move forward. So, again, let me take a step back and remind you the big picture here. Chapter 2 is covering chemistry, This particular portion of chapter 2 is biological molecules. There are 4 types of biological molecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. We are talking about carbohydrates. Um, we started off talking about the monomer of carbohydrates, which is monosaccharides. You put 2 monosaccharides together, you get a disaccharide, which we've already talked about. And if you put more than 2 together, then you have what we're talking about now, which is polysaccharides. And this is important for the exam because this is the polymers of carbohydrates. And if you remember last week when we started this conversation, I said a lot of the questions for the exam regarding the biological molecules are going to be you being able to differentiate between the 4 main types of carb biological molecules. And one of the ways you would do that is be able to identify the monomers and the polymers. So again, the monomers are monosaccharides, the polymers are polysaccharides. If only it was always that easy. You'll see it gets a little bit complicated when we get out of carbohydrates, but yeah, that's what it is. Anyway, when we first started this discussion last week as well, I think I had a picture. Well, forget the picture, but I asked. I said, "All right, when you're not in when you are not in a biology class and someone talks about carbs, what do you think of?" And it took a lot to get you guys to say anything, but eventually you guys started talking, and I think people said things like bread or rice. So yeah, when you're not in biology class, I think usually when people think of carbohydrates, this is what they think of. They think of polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are complex carbohydrates. So let's talk about them. If you download the PowerPoint, you can see um, all these monomers being linked together in dehydration reactions to make polysaccharides. So let's talk about the different types. Now, I know this is not a nutrition class. So, previously when I mentioned things like this, I said this is not going to be on the exam, but I'm telling you now, this one will be on the exam. But let me tell you what part of it. You're going to need to know that starch is one of the types of polysaccharides, and you're going to need to know the difference between starch and the other ones that I'm going to teach you. The most important thing, like for the exam anyway, this middle bullet point is what you're going to need to know. Starch is used by plants to store energy. Um, that's what you're going to need to know for the exam. Now, again, like I mentioned before, when you put together 3 or more monosaccharides, that gives us a polysaccharide. In this particular case for starch, it's literally just a long string of glucose monomers chained together. That's it. That's all starch is. And you can find it potatoes, grains, things like that. And of course, again, not a nutrition class, so that part I'm not gonna ask you. Um, I'm not gonna ask you what it's made of, but it wouldn't hurt to memorize that. But as you'll see, as we talk about the other types of polysaccharides, for the most part, with the exception of one of them, they all are long strings of glucose monomers. And you'll see, again, we'll go back to this idea of structure and function. You'll see that they have a very similar structure and therefore a very similar function. But again, starch used by plants to store energy. That's what you need to know for the exam. Any questions about this slide? All right. So this is what it looks like. This is an actual scanning a microscope picture here of starch in a cell. And then this green part is what it looks like, right? This is, like I said, it's just a bunch of glucose monomers linked together. And it does have that zigzag shape too. So that is the shape of glucose. I mean, excuse me, starch. So any questions? Okay. Actually, this is really horrible. I should have said this before, but can someone confirm that they can hear me now that we're 20 minutes into it? All right, let me back out then. I'm going to make sure I'm still recording and people can still hear me. Okay, microphone is on. I heard somebody maybe chatted something. Yes, thank you, Inca. Sorry. After last last week, one of the lectures where I did it on my own and nobody was online with me, I had to do it I think 4 or 5 times because each time something went wrong. So I'm like paranoid about that now. Anyway, jumping back into it. So again, you need to know that starch, which is what we just finished talking about, not what's on the screen now, but starch is what plants use to store energy. Now there's something called glycogen. And what you need to know about glycogen for the exam is this first bullet point. This is used by animals. Whoops. Excuse me, animals to store energy, right? So again, starch is how plants store energy. Glycogen is how animals store energy. And you can see here on the bottom right, this is what glycogen looks like. And if you look at it, hopefully that looks familiar to you. You're like, yeah, that looks a lot like starch, except it branches out and has branching patterns. And that's exactly right. So once again, this relationship between structure and function, that was a very similar structure, but slightly different. And in this case, it does indeed have a very similar function, right? And that function is to store energy. Both starch and glycogen both store energy, except one is for plants, and one is for animals. Um, you don't need to know this, but just so, at least not for the exam, but just so you know, glycogen is mostly stored in the liver and in your muscle cells, and that is broken down to release glucose, right? So when we talked about this earlier, if you're into running and things like that, you might have heard the term carbo loading. So where you eat a lot of carbs before a marathon, for example, and then that gets converted into glycogen and stored in your liver. That way, when you're running on this marathon, your muscles need fuel. They get it, but the fuel that they're using again is glucose, right? Your cells need glucose, but each one of these little things is a glucose, right? So it's a whole string of what it needs. It just breaks it off and uses it, breaks it off and uses it, so on and so forth. So, any questions about glycogen? All right, a third category. Here's another one you're probably very familiar with is cellulose. Um, I don't know. I'm probably not going to ask you this, but it is the most abundant organic compound on Earth. Um, it's basically what cell walls are made of, and you do need to know, right? So this second bullet point, that's important for the exam. It is used basically, and again, that you can read there, forms cable-like fibrils in plant cell walls. Shorthand, what you need to know for the exam is cellulose is what plants use for structure, right? Specifically their cell walls. So don't get that confused with starch. So remember, starch is how plants store energy. Cellulose is what they use for structure. And it's interesting because cellulose cannot be digested by enzymes produced by most animals. And that's why cellulose is actually healthy for you. And you may have also heard of it called fiber, heard of it referred to as fiber. And yes, fiber is very healthy for you. Again, we can't break it down, right? Humans cannot break down cellulose. Um, so, if we could, we would break down that cellulose into its parts, which are again glucose. But the glucose is, we can't do that. We don't have the enzymes to break it down, and you'll learn what an enzyme is later. But we can't do that. So for that reason, it's healthy. And I'll give you an example here. One second. There we go. Also bring this up. Yeah, so the reason it's healthy is again because we can't digest it. So just imagine that drawing, and I'll show you another drawing later. But that drawing this really long, big molecule that can't be digested. So as it's going through your digestion tract, it's literally just like sweeping out your digestive tract, so to speak. It's big, it's long, it's literally just taking stuff with it. So that helps you well stay healthy. Let's just leave it at that. Anyway, I brought this up. I didn't, I found this meme, and this goes back to something I've been talking about for a while, or mentioning a while, when we talk about people trying to scare you with chemistry, right? And a lot of times they can do this misinformation by giving you real information, truths, but giving it to you in a misleading way. And this is a great example. So, for example, here we go. Number 3, wood. Yes, cellulose is in all plant cells, right? Including wood, right? But cellulose is also in the plant cells and this lettuce and that Big Mac right there, right? It's also, in the plant cells of the wheat that made the bread, right? So yeah, yes, cellulose is in wood, but that doesn't mean there's wood in your fast food. Anyway, for extra credit, if you want to, you could look up any of this other stuff. What about L-cysteine? What about silicon dioxide? What about dimethyl polysiloxane? You can look up any of that. But again, the point here is they're just people try to scare you by misleading you, right? They say, "Hey, this thing is also in that thing, but that doesn't mean anything. Like, for example, most cleaners that you buy from, Kroger, those harsh cleaners, they have water in them too. But that doesn't mean water is bad for you, right? You need water. Now, that particular water is bad for you because it's also mixed with other stuff you shouldn't be ingesting. But anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. So here's a picture of what it looks like. Right. This is what cellulose looks like. And you can see, I mean, yes, just like the other two, starch and glycogen, which we've already talked about, it is indeed a string of glucose uh, monomers. But you can see here, they don't have the zigzag shape, right? The glycogen and starch had. So again, even without being a chemist or biologist, you know this idea of structure and function, right? So you could just look at this structure compared to the other two structures, and you could correctly assume that this has a different structure, a different function than those other two. And it does, right? The other two are used to store energy. This is used for structure. Well, specifically the cell walls of plants. Any questions about this slide? All right. There's another one, another category. It's called chitin. And this one's interesting. This is different than the other three because, unlike the other three, this is not a repeating string of glucose monomers, right? This one also has nitrogen in it. It's a nitrogenous carb. And mostly what it's used for is the arthropod exoskeletons, right? So these are examples of arthropods, right? Spiders, insects, crabs, things like that. But yeah, it's made up of chitin. And I'm probably not going to ask any questions about chitin. If I do, I'm certainly not going to get as deep as I would with the starch, glycogen, and cellulose. But anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. This is not in your book. So if you want to, maybe you take a picture of this or download the PowerPoint because I made this, right? This is not in the book. I made this for you. It's a great way to study because, again, you're going to need to know at least the differences and similarities between starch, glycogen, and cellulose, and maybe chitin. But again, so now you have this table. All that information from the textbook is just in this one nice little table. So it's a very easy way to help you study. Anyway, any questions about this? All right, I'll move forward. Again, some pictures. Of course, these pictures are from the old textbook. The old textbook didn't even mention um, chitin, so that's why it's not in this picture. But again, if I back up, you can see the chitin here. But anyway, if there's no questions, let's move forward. And I'll back up a step here again and give you the big picture. Again, chapter 2 is about chemistry. This particular portion of chapter 2 is about biological molecules. There are 4 types of biological molecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. We're done talking about carbohydrates. Now we're moving on to lipids. But that being said, there was one thing about carbohydrates that I didn't mention, but I'm going to mention it now, and it's kind of a segue into lipids. Another thing you need to know about carbohydrates is they are hydrophilic, meaning that means they anyway, that means they can dissolve in water, basically, right? Now, if you break down the word, the Greek background of that word, that's where water loving. That's what that means. But as far as we're concerned, chemically, right, it dissolves in water. Right, you can take sugar, you can dissolve it in water. Now, carbs. Oh, and the reason is, and we've talked about this before, is because carbohydrates are polar. They don't share their charge equally. And because of that, polar things are attracted to other polar things. And as you remember, well, hopefully you remember, and you're going to need to remember for the exam. It looks so horrible. Water is a polar molecule, right? The oxygen end has a slight negative charge. The hydrogen end has a slight positive charge. But anyway, yeah. So that's why carbohydrates are hydrophilic because they dissolve in water because they are polar. Lipids, on the other hand, are not. And you need to know that for the exam, right? Lipids are hydrophobic, which means they do not dissolve in water. You cannot mix it. Um, and not just water, but I'm sure you've seen this before, like this picture on the right, oil and vinegar, like in the salad dressing, right? They don't mix because even though, vinegar is vinegar, it's not water, but it is also hydrophilic. Hydrophilic things do not mix with hydrophobic things. Now, you might think to yourself, all right, well, I've had salad dressing before, all you have to do is shake it up. And if you can, right, you can shake it up and it appears to be mixed. And as far as eating is concerned, it is mixed. But at the molecular level, it is not mixed, right? That oil and the vinegar, even when you shake it up at the molecular level, they maintain their identity, so to speak, right? They do not mix molecularly. As a matter of fact, there's a word for that. It's called emulsifying. So when you shake it and it appears to be mixed, that's been emulsified. But anyway, yeah. So again, you need to know carbs are hydrophilic. You need to know lipids are hydrophobic, and obviously, you need to know what those terms mean. Now, when we talk about the other ones, when we talk about proteins and nucleic acids, we won't talk about whether or not they're hydrophilic or hydrophobic, especially with the proteins, because you'll learn those proteins are interesting because they have all kinds of different properties, right? Some proteins, or some parts of the proteins are hydrophilic, some parts of the proteins are hydrophobic. So, again, for the exam, when it comes to hydrophobic versus hydrophilic, you're only going to need to know that for carbs and lipids. So, any questions so far? All right. The next word for attendance is oil. Oil is the next word for attendance. And I will give you a couple seconds to write that down. All right. Oh, yeah, one more little thing on this. But we've already talked about it, but there it is in writing. An example of what we're discussing here is oil and vinegar not mixing. So, another thing that's worth mentioning about lipids, even though I'm not going to test you on this, is they are not necessarily as large, right? So, starch and glycogen and chitin, right? And cellulose, right? Those are very, very, very long molecules, right? Just repeating monomers of glucose over and over and over again. And lipids are not necessarily like that. And they're also not necessarily polymers, right? Because a polymer, like we talked about with carbohydrates, that's made up of repeating monomers, right? So it's glucose, 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 glucose. That would be a polymer. In this case, they're not technically polymers because they are made of different parts, and you're going to need to know the parts, but they're not repeating parts. They're different parts, and that'll make more sense once we get to it. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So yeah, technically, lipids are a little bit different than the other ones that we talk about. Again, because of this relationship between monomers and polymers doesn't exist with lipids, but still, at least with one of the type of lipids, you're going to need to know the parts that make it up. So, anyway, any questions so far? All right. So let's talk about the different types of lipids. And one of the most common ones that you'll need to know about, and you're probably already familiar with, is just fat. And I mean that in the dietary sense, right? Fat, like in your food. That's what we're talking about here. Those are also known as triglycerides. So this is something you need to know, right? You need to know that the word fat and triglyceride in this sense, they're the same thing. So that will probably be a test question. You also need to know that this is falls under the category of lipids, right? So you need to know these things. And again, like I mentioned in the previous slide, you also need to know what they're made of. Like again, they're not necessarily monomers, but there are parts that make them up, and this is it right here. And this will make more sense when I show you a picture of it, but this is just the introduction. Triglycerides have one glycerol molecule that have three fatty acids attached to them. And again, that'll make more sense when I show you, but that kind of makes sense with the name of it, right? Triglyceride. That's where it gets its name, right? It's got one glycerol molecule within three fatty acid molecules. And the fatty acid molecules are where it's at as far as diets are concerned, or eating it is concerned, because that is where the energy comes from. They're long, energy rich molecules. Just like I said last week when I showed you that picture of, I think it was a picture of gasoline, and it was a picture of a hamburger, and we mentioned how, when you break down gasoline in the presence of oxygen, it releases energy. Same thing here, right? When you break down fatty acids in the presence of oxygen, it releases energy. What you don't need to know, but we're going to mention it anyway, is that fats have two times the energy of carbs, right? Like per weight, right? So a gram of fat would have twice the energy of a gram of a carbohydrate. And it's also stored in adipose cells. So, yes, when you think of fat, whether you're talking about dietary fat, which is what I keep mentioning, but also, yes, the fat on your body, right? It's stored in what we call adipose cells. That's basically a fat cell. All right. So any questions so far? Okay. If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch these parts come together to make a triglyceride. Obviously, as they come together, that would be a dehydration reaction, right? Um, but anyway, like I said, download it and you can watch it if you want. But here's a picture of what we're talking about, right? So here's just one glycerol and one fatty acid. And you can see, again, that's going to attach to the glycerol right there. It's going to produce water, which makes it a dehydration reaction. And then here at the bottom is the full thing, right? This is a complete um, triglyceride. And I'm going to bring this up later, but I might as well introduce you to this concept right now. The fatty acids are different. Like I said, there's three of them, right? Sometimes they're all straight, like this one, this one. Sometimes they have a little kink in them, like this one, due to having a double bond. Again, this will be a little bit important, a little bit more important later, but for now, I just wanted to bring it up since we have it in a picture. So again, sometimes they're straight, sometimes they have a kink in them, sometimes they have more than one kink in them. You can see the difference here between, I'm going to call that one number one and number two. You can see number two happens to be longer than number one. And this is, they all vary, right? Different sizes, different lengths, some straight, some not. So this particular picture that you're seeing, this is not what all triglycerides look like. Now they all do have the one glycerol molecule and three fatty acids, but again, the point here is that the fatty acids, those are not all similar. So they will not all look like this picture. And that will be important here in a few minutes. But are there any questions so far? Okay. What are they used for? You're going to need to know this. And this is probably stuff you already know. Fats are essential because we use it for energy storage, right? Human, like animals, use it for energy storage. Yes, we have glycerol, or yeah, glycerol. Good grief. Glycerol is what made it. I'm sorry. Glycogen, right? Like what we talked about with the carbs. Yes, we also store energy as glycogen. But as you know, if you eat more calories than you burn, your body stores those calories in fat. Unfortunately, uh, I've been so busy these past 2 semesters, I have not been burning as many calories as I used to. So I've been storing some energy. Uh, I'm ready to get back to running because I've got enough energy stored up. I should be fine. But anyway, that's one of the obvious ones. One of the few less obvious ones is cushioning, right? That's why your rear end, your rear ends for humans usually have more fat on them because it is literally for cushioning, for sitting down. Or I don't know if you know this or not, but the bottom of your heels, the bottom of your feet have fat for cushioning, right? To protect those muscles and bones and all the parts of your feet. Another one that's less intuitive is insulation, right? Humans don't maybe not think about this very often because when humans are cold, we put on clothes or we make a fire or turn on the heat or go somewhere warmer, right? Not all animals can do this. So some animals, like polar bears, for example, right? They need that fat. They need that helps them stay warm. But yeah, you're going to need to know those three essential functions for triglycerides. Um, any questions about this slide? All right. Let's see, 8:39, 40. So we got 10 minutes. All right, we got about 10 minutes left. Now here's where it gets really interesting, in my opinion, especially now because there's a lot of stuff going on the federal government with different recommendations about health. And I am not a nutritionist, so I'm not going to say what I've heard is incorrect. I would just say that what I've heard recently just has me questioning things, and I haven't had time to look into it yet. I want to know the logic. So I've heard people say now that saturated fats are good for you, and I don't see how that's possible. And again, I'm going to do the research, look into it on my own. But this is still in this PowerPoint. I've been teaching it for years. So I'm going to teach you how unsaturated fats are healthy and how saturated fats are unhealthy. And if it turns out I'm wrong, then I will change my PowerPoint, but I have no evidence to suggest otherwise yet. Anyway, let's talk about it. First of all, let's talk about what this means. And I'm sure you've heard these terms before: saturated fat, unsaturated fat. What does that mean? Well, for the exam, what you need to know is that when we're saying it's saturated, what we mean is it has all the hydrogens it can. Man, this pictures are messed up because this one should be down here. This one should be up here. Anyway, saturated fats, they're saturated with hydrogen, right? So I'm sure you heard the term saturated before, even when you're not talking about biology or chemistry or food, right? So again, if I were to go for a run this summer and I come back and I'm just my shirt is just soaking wet from sweat, you would say it's saturated, meaning that shirt cannot hold any more sweat molecules because it's it, right? It can't hold anymore. It has as much as it can. Same thing here. Saturated fats are saturated with hydrogen, and that's something you need to know for the exam, right? They have all the hydrogen they can. And all three of them, remember a fatty acid, this is going to look horrible. There's it's a glycerol molecule with how that yeah, that messed it up. Anyway, it's glycerol molecule with three fatty acids. So to be considered saturated, all three of them have to be completely saturated with hydrogens. Unsaturated fats are not completely saturated with hydrogens because they have this right here. They have that double bond. So that because there's at least one double bond for these unsaturated fats, because of that, that could have been a hydrogen that it was bonded here, but it's not. Now you might be wondering, well, what's that have to do with health? Well, this is how it works. At the molecular level, again, I mentioned this when we first started this portion of the chapter. Um, you can look at this without being a chemist and just look at the shape, right? Imagine trying to stack a bunch of saturated fats on top of each other. That would work nice and easily, right? And because they're flat, they're straight, you can just stack them up. It'd be nice and easy to put them together. Unsaturated fats, because they have this kink, and look, they're not all like this, right? They don't all have this kink right there, right? This particular one happens to have it on the one, two, three, four, five, sixth carbon. There happens to be a double bond right there, but they don't, they vary. So some saturated fats might have it at the fifth carbon or the 12th carbon, and this one doesn't even have 12 carbons, right? So they're all different shapes. And because of that, these unsaturated fats, they don't stack on top of each other nicely at the molecular level. And because of that, right, unsaturated fats, often called oils, are liquid at room temperature because they just don't sit still, basically, right? Because they can't really stack on top of each other, so they don't sit still. So they're generally healthy. And because the reason is, and I'll show you on the next slide, what happens with saturated fats is because they're so good at like just sticking together. That's what they do. They stick together, and this clogs your arteries, right? And this is a great picture from I think the old textbook about how it will clog your arteries because they stick together. Most animal fats are high in saturated fats. I'm not going to test you on that, but now you know. And again, like I said, at the molecular level, because of their shapes, they're really good at sticking together. They easily stack. That makes them solid at room temperature. So that is why saturated fats are unhealthy. Um, just like anything else in this course, I invite you to look up other sources, right? Especially right now with this topic, because again, I've heard people are saying, trying to make claims that saturated fats are healthy now. So I'm curious to see the evidence and the explanation behind that. But anyway, any questions about this slide? All right, let's move forward then. Let's see, 44, yeah, 6 minutes. That's good. Um, Again, this is not a nutrition class, so I'm not going to ask you this, but just so you know, when we're talking about fats, again, most animal fats are saturated fats, but most plant and fish fats are unsaturated. So they're mostly um, healthy for you, generally speaking. There are some exceptions, like tropical plants. Even though it is a plant, they do have a lot of saturated fats. Um, but anyway, again, this is just for your own knowledge. I'm not going to ask you any questions about this. But do you have any questions before we move forward? All right. Good time to remind you too, at the end of when you send the email for attendance or for participation points, you also need to include one question about the material. But just to remind you, that doesn't necessarily mean you don't know. You might not even have a question. Maybe you understood everything. But if that's the case, then just pretend like you're writing a question that I could use on an exam or a quiz or something like that. Anyway, here's something else that's not going to be on the exam. This is from the old textbook. It just breaks down the different fats of corn oil, palm oil, and butter. You certainly do not need to know this. If anything, and most likely this won't happen either, but if anything, I might give you this picture and say something like, you know, which one has the most saturated fat? Corn oil, palm oil, or butter oil. And you could just look at it and make, oh, well, yeah, it would be saturated fat. And really quickly, even though we don't talk about this, it's on the screen, so I might as well bring it up. Here you can see it's polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, and I haven't even mentioned those terms. But as you can imagine, like I said, this is probably going to be another horrible drawing. If we have a triglyceride, right, those are supposed to be straight, and then that, man, that's not supposed to be jutting out like that. But anyway, that one has a kink, right? This one would be a mono unsaturated, right? Because it only one of the three fatty acids is unsaturated. But obviously, if you have more than one, that would be polyunsaturated. But again, that is just for your own knowledge. Another thing that's just for your own knowledge, and I'm probably not going to talk about or test you on, is this idea of converting unsaturated fats to saturated fats. This is generally not good for you, but they do this by adding hydrogen, right? Because again, unsaturated means they don't have all the hydrogens that they could. So chemically, these food manufacturers, they add the hydrogen, right? They get rid of those double bonds. They straighten up the molecule. Now it has its purposes, right? It helps the food last longer. It's also really good for frying. And when I say good for frying, I'm not testing. I don't mean like I'm not just not mentioning its flavor or its health. I'm just saying it's good for frying when like smoke point and things like that. Um, it can be solid at room temperature, which can be handy. Um, but the bad thing is it can create trans fats, and we're not really talking much about that. But you can look into it again for extra credit if you want. But trans fats are basically bad for you. And as far as I know, I don't think there's any change from the federal government on this one. I don't think anyone said anything different about trans fats. I think everybody still agrees that trans fats are very bad for your health, but I don't remember for sure. But anyway, some examples are like margarine. Some margarines have it. Some peanut butter has it. And the way it's bad for you is it increases your bad cholesterol. So again, for extra credit, I invite you to look that up. Like how do trans fat increase your cholesterol? Um, if you want to look it up. Anyway, any questions about this slide? We've got 2 minutes left. All right. Some more stuff, some other examples, fats that you've heard of. So I'm going to talk about them, and I'm probably not going to test you on them. But omega-3 fatty acids, these are really good. Um, they're essential fatty acids, meaning they're required, like your body needs them. Again, to remind you of something we said previously in this chapter, your body breaks down these molecules because it uses the building blocks to build other stuff, right? So your body needs omega-3 fatty acids. And again, for extra credit, you could look up why. Why does your body need those? But I'm not going to ask you, and I'm not going to talk about it right now. Um, and again, the reason we say it's required, not only does your body need it, but we can't make it. So, in a dietary sense, when you hear something say something is essential, what that means is we need it in our diet because we cannot produce it. And there's other examples of that. We'll talk about that later. Anyway, it's healthy. It reduces heart disease. It reduces arthritis symptoms. It reduces irritable bowel syndrome symptoms. And you can find it in oily fish like salmon and tuna and stuff like that, and also nuts. So, any questions about that? The last word for attendance is nuts. So, send me this email before 9 a.m. Have all the list of attendance words. Uh, yep. And if you're watching the video, so not if you're with me right now, not if you're live streaming, but if you're watching the video, don't forget you needed screenshots. Don't forget you need a question about the material. And that's it. I'll be online at least until 10 o'clock for office hours. And don't forget, again, lab 2 and pre-lab 3 are past due. And since the semester is young and since we've been having weather issues, you can still turn it in for half credit. So go ahead and get that done and let me know if you have any questions. Have a good week.